Alright.
This is a postcard showing life in the San Blas Islands. You can see here in the background this huge hut. This would be called the council house, so that in here all the business for the island would be conducted. The chiefs would be here, and the second, and they often would go all the way down to even a third chief or more. And so the hammocks would be strung up in here, and then there would be the chief and the second and third, and then they would have what were called voceros. And so voceros is like for the voice, and they would be the speakers, and then they would have the cantules. And we see here a couple of the cantules with their huge big parrot feathers. So there's a lot of parrots over in the jungle, and they would get these, and you can see there's a lot of other little ones at the base, and then these huge ones, so that at the puberty ceremony for the girl, which is the most important unifying ceremony they have in the island for everyone in there, then the cantules would be there, and frequently they would have these panpipes and be playing those and singing and dancing with those. And there would be panpipes, so that there would be, I had just a small one that we looked at earlier, so they could be up here with their pan flutes playing those. Many people would be having rattles, and so with the rattles it would be quite a lot of sound. We can see here these Cuna Indian women. Here's one that does not have any particular jewelry on. She's wearing kind of a common modern dress now. This woman has one with a mola on it here, and you can see the design and pattern there, and this would usually be the same on the front and the back. These women here have all of these gold-plated breastplates, and so this would be the kind of skirt that they would have, sort of like a sarong, where they would wrap it around their feet. Here's one where you can see all of the beads around their feet and down here. And earlier we looked at what were some of the kind of necklaces, kind of beadwork that you would have to wrap around your feet to be able to get that pattern to come out precisely right. So these have them here. People would usually go around barefoot in the villages, so their feet were really tough. There's a lot of coral all the way around the island, and so they could go out and run on this coral, which was like razor blades if it were us, in terms of how sharp all that would be, but they had like leather feet. Here's a little girl who does have a big gold item necklace here, similar to what some of these.
Hold on. There we go. I lost it.
And a little girl here with the same sort of gold plate as these. And so they would usually wear these bandanas like on their heads. And so we see all of the variations of just plain dress to just with the mola to here with all of the gold work. And these then were the two cantules, where they have these big, big, tall parrot feathers coming from there. You can see that the women are very short. The Cunas are among the world's shortest people. The average woman would be about 4'8", and the average male about 5'2". So you can see they're quite short in here as well. And they would usually wear these kind of fedora hats. Sometimes they would be black, like this looks a little bit black, like a naile or medicine man would wear, and sometimes they're just others, dressed up for this special occasion. So from way back, the women always had equal rights. The women were always very powerful with the Cunas, because they felt that the way all the earth was created is that the Earth Mother sat down one day, parted her legs, and a certain colored blood came out. That brought out certain creatures with that blood. Next day she would do the same thing, And I have some of these in medicine pictures that I got from their medicine books, where she would sit down and a different colored blood would come out and different creatures would come out then. So like in terms of man and turtle came out at the same time, so turtle meat would be taboo to eat because it would really be like your blood brother. And women then were frequently referred to as their flowers. Women were given a great deal of respect, and they're also very, very gentle people. All of the trips made down there, the 7 trips I think it was, I never ever saw a child hit. I never heard a child yelled at, because you can't see it here because nobody's moving around, but they'd always pick up and have a child carried around on their hip. So whether it was the mother, the grandmother, an aunt, a sister, or a niece or whatever, they would always be carrying the child around on their hip. So there was a great deal of skin-to-skin contact. They were never expected, they were never yelled at, for example, if they had an accident and had urinated on the floor or pooped on the floor, because they recognized that they were too young to have control over those bodily functions. So they would never yell at them in any way. They didn't expect the child to say they were going to have an eat until their language skills were sufficiently developed that they could speak about it. So the women always had voting rights from way back, so that a couple nights a week there would be meetings up here in the council hut to decide what they were going to do with how many fish they now had or something else, because they were very fond of developing societies, sociedades, and there would be a fishing one and there would be one for various other kinds of activities. So they loved having group activities, being together in groups. When you were there, they loved to be close to you, and it was, in the beginning it was almost uncomfortable because they would come up and, because we had much more body hair than they did, they were very smooth skin, they would come up and want to rub the hair on your forearm, and so they always sort of stroking you, and it was a little off-putting in the beginning. And you can see here how several of them have ties on, not all of them, but still have ties, and in some of the nuchus that will also be talked about in the camera, you'll see that the little nuchus have ties on because these are associated with Americans there, and so with the Americans, they basically had very friendly feelings toward the Americans because the Americans had never gone in and created any problems with them or difficulties. They frequently hired them to work over in the Panama Canal area. They frequently were cooks and so forth, so they would go over there and have a steady job, make a fair amount of money. Then it wasn't too difficult to get back home to the islands because it was not that far away. So they're always, I say, very libertarian. Women had an equal vote in the council hut. Women were allowed to speak up. You would see women sitting here in they looked like rows of pews almost with the benches in there. And the women could be there nursing a child, because a child could be nursed until as late as age 4 or 5. So you can imagine that they would be a very peaceful group if you never got yelled at because you had soiled yourself or wet inappropriately, because they didn't expect that until you could speak. So you never yelled at for that. You never really yelled at for anything. So if you've never been yelled at, you've never been hit, you've always been carried around up until age 4 or 5 on some other female member's hip, there's close bonding between them, and there's a great deal of family connection and closeness with them. And if you go here through the village, these houses are very close together. You can hardly walk straight through them. You almost have to go through sideways to get between them. So you have all of this really close connection with all of your neighbors and their houses, and then there'd be a large number of people in each of the houses sleeping together. So it was always this unity idea, and then with the societies that they had, it was almost like they didn't know what to do with them. When they had a big supply of fish or whatever else, the coconut or whatever else they were collecting, then it would be like, now how do we get rid of this stuff? How can we handle it? So it wasn't really in terms of trying to make a great deal of money on them. It was to be able to have something they could do together, like perhaps like our equivalent of a knitting circle. And so you'd always hear the kids laughing a lot. There was a great deal of humor, and also among the adult Cunas they laughed very frequently. They had no jails, and the only people they had ever had any trouble with was the Pan American National Guard. So they had no jails, they had no insane asylums or anything of that sort. Everybody worked together happily, supported each other together, looked out for each other. And so then later on they started to have problems with everybody wanted to try and civilize these poor, stupid, uneducated Indians. And so there was a Baptist church came in and tried to convert them. There was a Mormon church that came in and tried to convert them. Later on there were Pentecostal groups trying to come in, so that they needed to learn how to think in civilized ways and get rid of all of their pagan ways, when they were in their pagan mode of really respecting each other and working together. So in the island, coconuts were worth a dime a piece, so there would be each larger island, and there was about 365 islands, and only about 40 of those were inhabited, and some of them were very remotely inhabited. And then I think the biggest village had about 1,000 people there. And the way they could expand the land is they would go out, because all around here were coral reefs, and they would go out with a boat and a great big metal bar, like we would use as a fulcrum to try and get rocks out of the soil, and they would chip off pieces of coral, bring it back to the edge of the island, and gradually by doing that they could expand the width and length of the island by filling it up with coral, then putting sand over it. When it came time to build a house, you would go to the council hut and tell them that you wanted to get permission to build another house, and so you could get more coral and then make the island a little bit bigger, but they had to approve of it. Once they approved of it, then it got to be a community project. They would put up the big black palm stakes that it was built on, and then these are all out of dried palm leaves up here, and these would last maybe 10 years or so. And so everybody would get together and climb up, and all of the men would help out, and they had all of these different kind of twisted up palm leaves as kind of like rope to tie it. And so a house would usually be put up in a day's time, because the whole village would turn out to help you, so it cost zero to do it. Everybody, once you got permission from the council hut and the chiefs, then everybody they looked like little monkeys almost. They were so agile, climbing around on all the posts up there, creating the houses. So it was a wonderfully peaceful kind of feeling from them. And usually when it came time to go to sleep, the child was put in a hammock and then swung in the hammock and sung. So one of the women members of that family would sing to them as they were going to sleep. So if you can imagine an existence where you're nursed to your maybe age 5, there's adequate supply of food because you've got all of the fish in the ocean nearby, you've got animals over in the jungle, and the jungle would be less than a mile away. You got all of the coconuts, and the coconuts were worth a dime a piece, so you could go up to the store and whatever it was, buy it for 60 cents, and it was 6 coconuts to buy it. So money literally grew on trees. And one of the other traditions about the importance of the palm trees was that they would, when a child was born, its umbilical cord was taken and put at the base of a palm tree, and then that provided the nourishment for the palm tree to grow up. So that was your palm tree nourished by your own placenta. And so there would be different family plots of different islands where it was primarily just coconuts. Would be a certain family's coconuts there. And then they had coconut trees over in the mainland growing there. And the guy that I had gone down there with so many times, Matt Chapin, who got his doctorate from the University of Texas, trying to learn about all of their chanting and all of their oral history and all of the stories about how the world was made and all of their whole rich mythological history. He was well accepted there because he spoke the language, and he was from the Peace Corps, and he was trying to teach them about how they could get more coconuts, because coconuts was literally money. And so what they would do is when they had a piece of land, they would try and plant as many coconut trees as they could very close together, because they thought, okay, if it's good to have coconuts and I can get in 200 coconut trees here, then I'll have all of that amount of money. But he knew from research that had been done in the States and so forth that you actually got a higher yield if you put the coconuts further apart, because then you would get more coconuts per tree. So even though there weren't as many trees, each one would have a far greater yield. So he had a great deal of difficulty trying to communicate that or getting the Cunas to accept it, because to them, coconuts grow on trees, and the more trees you got, the more money you should have. Whereas if you waited, and it took about 7 years for a coconut tree to mature, so it wasn't something you could get instant results on, so you'd have to get them to say, well, wait 7 years and we'll show you. Let's do 2 of them here, put all the trees you can on this island, as dense as you want, and we'll spread them out on this, and then we'll check again 7 years later. So he's never able to quite convince them of the logic of why it would be better to have a less density of coconut trees there. And I had mentioned earlier when we were talking about the hair when the women went through puberty and was cut and kept wrapped up always with them, so that when their time came to be buried, they would go over to the nearby island, and it would be the nearby mainland, and then there would be big underground pits there, and then all of they'd be put in a hammock, and the poles put in it and tie up the hammock, and then all of their goods, their cooking materials and so forth would be buried with them, so that on the other side they would have everything they needed to be able to survive. So it was a wonderful culture, just a really rare opportunity to be able to spend time with them. And I'd gone over there 3 times with Brett, and twice with Lance, and once with Keith. And so the Indians had a lot of trouble with Lance, because Lance was about at least 6'2", and you got these guys who were 5'2", their average height. And so Lance would be just towering over them. And when we went down, when I was betting Lance together one time, they couldn't believe that Lance was only 15 years old, and they kept saying, 15 años, 15 años, because he just towered up above them. So again, they're among the world's shortest people, except for the Negrito pygmies over in Africa and so forth. Yet their favorite game to play was basketball. So the world's shortest people are playing the game that in the States is dominated by 7-foot giants. But they loved it, and they would just all day long play, because their feet were like leather, like a couple inches thick of leather, and they'd be back when it didn't matter whether there was sharp coral or not, it could just run over that like it was not at all present. So I mean, it was friendly competition. Nobody ever got really angry at anybody else. So nobody ever really got angry at anybody else. There was never any cases of like murder by machete or anything. If they decided somebody was completely disturbed, what I had heard was the way they would deal with that is they would poison the person, and then within a couple of days later they would be dead. But that would be a very rare occasion. So I've got a lot of books that I've purchased through Amazon telling about their chants and telling about all the others, because the Peace Corps guy that I mentioned, Mac Chapin, had helped me. Every year I would gather dreams down there, and every year I would do some ESP testing down there, and then trying to look to see if I could find patterns between the dreams and the ESP score. So he translated up all of the dreams for me, and he served as the guide on several of the trips that I made down there. And I've mentioned how highly regarded he was. And so one of the chants that he recorded, called the Mui Gala, was called by Levi Strauss, one of the big major anthropologists, the most beautiful, most extensive chant talking about the mythology of any culture in the world. And so when they had a birth took place, it would be inside one of the houses, and usually what they would do is they'd slip the hammock that the woman was in so the baby could pass and come down below, and there would be a little canoe with water in it, so it would be caught and dipped into the water in that canoe beneath. And the medicine men would be there, and they were not, at that time in the ancient times, were not allowed to be able to see the birth. Their penalty would have been if they witnessed birth to be put to death. So it's considered an exclusive, secret rite and so forth that was totally involving the women, in that it would have been sacrilegious for any man to actually see the birth process. So they would tell him what's happening, and he would be on the outside of this little enclosure inside the house. Then he would say, do this, do that, or whatever else. So he would give sort of remote control answers to their questions as to how to deal with different medical situations. So when you were in here, it was very cleaned up. All the hammocks were pulled up to the ceiling. All the clothes were up there in the ceiling, and so excuse me, down below was very neat and tidy, and they were always taking their little benches from the palm trees and sweeping and cleaning up. They were also very clean with regard to personal hygiene. They had water that they would bring over from the river, and they would go over bathing in the river on a daily basis, and we smelled very bad to them, so they always kept bringing us water and wanting us to wash more, to take some kind of a shower, because our waga, which is their name for like an American or stranger, was very strong and kind of repulsive to them. So those are some I could, as I look around on here, I keep getting more and more free associations to. And when they had that 4-day ceremony with the adolescent girl, the girl going through pubescence there, and everybody gathered for that, and so people would come from the adjoining islands to come over and participate in that 4-day ceremony, and they had huge big like cigars they would smoke, and I have one of the cigars that we'll be photographing later, But instead of a cigar where you have the lighted end out here, the lighted end would be put in your mouth, and the smoke would be drawn in and then put out. And during this time, you're kind of required to just keep drinking the chicha. So the chicha was the fermented juice of the coconut, and it would take several days to brew this up in this huge big pots. I've got one of the pictures of a woman with one of the big chicha pots, and so it would take a long time to get this properly fermented, and it was somebody's job. They would chicha experts, so they would declare when it was okay to it was appropriately fermented. And then during that 4-day ceremony, with all of the dancing and all of the chanting and all of the other ritual that went on, you were required to just drink until you fell down, and then they would carry you out and throw you in the river, and that would sort of sober you up. But since this was such a special sacred ceremony, that was the way you were honoring it, by being in this altered state of consciousness during the 4-day experience. So I think
Were there any albinos in that picture?
There are no albinos in here, although the Cunas did have the world's highest rate of albinism. Ordinarily, in a population, say here in the States, you'd have about 1 albino per 10,000 population. So the Cunas were a little less than maybe 20,000, so you'd expect like 2 albinos amongst all of the Cunas. But when I was down there, I saw a huge number of albinos, and the birth rate was much more. They had a much higher rate than that. They were, had the pure white skin, they had the pink eyes, that had the nystagmus. They have an unusual many albinos are double jointed, and they were needed for the culture, because there were certain ceremonies that when it's going to be like a lunar eclipse, then the albino would have to go out and with a bow and arrow shoot the moon so that the people would all be safe. So without the albino doing it and participating in certain other ceremonies, they wouldn't be valid. So they're highly praised as a facilitator for the energy that was needed for some of these ceremonies to be conducted properly. But on the other hand, they were not valued, because the worst thing you could say about a Cuna was that they were lazy. They got up very early in the morning, went over and worked all day, either fishing or over in the jungle, getting game, and were tending to the coconut trees and so forth. So to be lazy was the worst thing you could say. Yet if the albinos went over into that tropical sun, they were at high risk for cancer, and so their lifespan would have been probably less than about 30 years, and they also were frequently infertile, and so they couldn't really reproduce themselves very well there. But the albinism was a simple recessive gene, so you could almost tell from when the man and the woman were to be married, that they were highly likely to have an albino child, because it was a recessive gene, and the parents, if they were a little lighter skinned and were to be bonded, there'd be a high likelihood that they would have an albino child. So I don't see any, and so where they would frequently wind up, as would be then involved with religious ceremony, they would take the palm leaves and the pieces of them and weave things like fire fans, and so I've got a fire fan that we can look at later that you would use to fan the fire there for cooking. And they would sometimes be school teachers, and so they would have then much more domestic ones that would tend to keep them in, and where they would not have to do heavy physical labor. So interesting on that account as well. So I was there, I believe it was 6 times gathering the dreams and doing the ESP testing, and then frequently the guide would be Mac Chapin, and he would take us on. So we would go during the various trips. So we pretty well went to all the major islands, all up and down, because they're all off the start more or less just below the Panama Canal, and then carry all the way down to the northern part of Colombia. And there was still like one island way down off of coast of Colombia that still had the Cunas. There were some Cunas inland in the jungles, but by and large most of them went out to the islands because they were safe from the animals. They also could have access to all of the fishing that was there. But then in recent years there's been a problem in that the waters in the villages have been rising, and I saw a couple pictures like in National Geographic or something similar, where now the water was beginning to rise up with all of the changes in the climate and so forth going on, that the climate changes are causing the islands to get flooded more frequently. So I had read within the past year that they were petitioning to be able to go back over into the jungle and be able to establish their villages close to the coastline over there, where before they had always liked being separate. And so they had been known for a long time, because when the early Spaniards went there, they talked about seeing this tribe of white Indians. So the albinos existed way back then during the early 1500s and so forth, when the Spanish were coming in to exploit them and get all of their gold and silver and so forth that the Incas had been mining. Okay. I get all kind of sentimental when I go back and